There are some secrets that become part of your bones. They calcify there, growing heavier with each passing year until you can feel their weight in every movement, every breath. I'm 55 years old now, and I've carried mine for 30 years. 30 years of waking up in the middle of the night, hearing wind through pine trees, and remembering a voice that shouldn't exist. 30 years of looking at my reflection and seeing the eyes of a man who knows something the world isn't ready to understand. I'm telling this now because I'm tired. Tired of carrying it alone. Tired of the silence. My name is John, and when I was 25 years old, I met a Wendigo in the woods of northern Minnesota. I know what you're thinking. I've thought it myself 1,000 times. Wendigos are legends, stories told by the Ojibwe to explain the darkness that lives in desperate men, the hunger that consumes until there's nothing human left. But legends have to come from somewhere, and what I found in those woods in the winter of 1995 was as real as the scars on my hands, as real as the cold that still lives in my chest when I remember. I was a forest ranger back then, stationed at a remote outpost about 40 miles from the Canadian border. It was solitary work, which suited me fine. I'd grown up in Minneapolis, but the city had never felt right. Too many people, too much noise, too many expectations pressing in from all sides. The woods offered something different. Silence that felt clean. Space to think. Space to be. The outpost was a small cabin with a wood stove, a radio that worked half the time, and enough supplies to last through the long Minnesota winters. My job was simple. Monitor the forest, watch for fires, report any unusual activity, maintain the trails. I'd see maybe 3 or 4 hikers during the summer months, and come winter, I'd go weeks without seeing another soul. It was exactly what I wanted. I remember the winter it happened with perfect clarity. It came early that year, arriving in mid-October with a cold snap that froze the lake solid in a matter of days. By November, we had 3 feet of snow on the ground, and the temperature hadn't risen above 0 in 2 weeks. The forest became a different world. Silent, crystalline, beautiful in a way that could kill you if you weren't careful. The pine trees sagged under the weight of snow. The air was so cold it burned your lungs. At night, you could hear the trees cracking, the sound echoing through the darkness like gunshots. I loved it. The isolation, the purity, the sense of being completely alone in a vast wilderness. I'd spend my days checking the trails on snowshoes, marking hazards, clearing fallen branches. Evenings, I'd sit by the wood stove with a book, listening to the wind, feeling grateful for the walls around me and the fire at my feet. It was mid-December when I first heard about the abandoned logging camp. A supply helicopter pilot mentioned it in passing, said he'd spotted some old structures about 8 miles north of my position, deep in a valley that hadn't been logged in 40 years. The company had gone bankrupt in the 50s, just walked away and left everything standing. The pilot said it looked eerie from the air, like a ghost town frozen in time. I'd been meaning to explore that area anyway. There were some old trails on my maps that I wanted to verify, and the logging camp would make a good landmark for future reference. So one morning, when the weather looked stable, I packed a rucksack with emergency supplies, strapped on my snowshoes, and headed north. The forest that morning was perfectly still. The sky was that pale, washed-out blue you only see in deep winter, and the sun hung low on the horizon, giving everything a golden tint. My breath formed clouds that hung in the air. The only sound was the crunch of my snowshoes and the occasional groan of a tree branch weighted with ice. It took me about 4 hours to reach the valley. The logging camp emerged from the trees like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. There were 5 or 6 structures, all of them half buried in snow, their roofs sagging, their walls dark with age and moisture. The largest building looked like it had been the main hall, maybe a bunkhouse for the loggers. Smaller structures surrounded it, a tool shed, an office, what might have been a mess hall. Everything was weathered gray, and icicles hung from every surface like teeth. I approached slowly, that feeling you get when you're somewhere you're not supposed to be prickling along my spine. The snow around the buildings was undisturbed except for animal tracks. Deer, maybe a wolf or 2. No human footprints. No sign that anyone had been here in decades. The main building's door was half open, jammed by ice and warped wood. I had to put my shoulder into it to force it wider. The hinges screamed. Inside, the darkness was absolute. I pulled out my flashlight, and that's when I smelled it. Death. Rot. Something wrong. The smell was so thick I could taste it, a physical presence in the cold air. I covered my nose and mouth with my scarf and stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The interior of the building was chaos. Furniture overturned, walls torn open, scratches gouged deep into the wooden floor. Something had been living here, something desperate and violent. I saw bones scattered in the corners. Animal bones, I told myself, though some of them looked too large, too wrong. And then I heard it. A sound from the far corner of the room. Not quite a breath, not quite a growl. Something between pain and hunger and rage. I swung my flashlight toward the sound. What I saw should have sent me running. Should have made me flee back to the outpost and never return. But I couldn't move. I could only stand there, flashlight trembling in my hand, staring at something that couldn't exist. It was crouched in the corner, skeletal and massive, its skin pulled tight over bones that jutted at impossible angles. Its head was elongated, almost deer-like, but wrong. Too many joints, too many shadows. Its eyes caught my flashlight beam and reflected it back, glowing like coals. And it was looking right at me. For a moment that lasted forever, we stared at each other. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't work. Then it spoke. Not in English. Not in any language I recognized. But somehow, impossibly, I understood. Help me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen between the doorway and that impossible creature. Time seemed to collapse in on itself, becoming meaningless. In my memory, it feels like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, my temples, my fingertips. The flashlight shook in my hand, making the shadows dance and shift. The creature didn't move. It stayed crouched in that corner, its elongated limbs folded at angles that made my eyes hurt to follow. Up close, I could see details that my mind kept trying to reject. Its skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent in places, showing the dark shapes of organs beneath. Its ribs protruded like the bars of a cage. Its hands, if you could call them that, ended in fingers that were too long, too many-jointed, more like the legs of a spider than anything human. But it was the eyes that held me. They were sunken deep in that skull-like face, but they were aware. Intelligent. Desperate. Help me, it said again, and this time I heard it differently. Not words exactly, but meaning that bypassed language entirely and went straight into my head. It was dying. Starving. Trapped. I should have run. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get out, to leave this impossible thing behind and never look back. But there was something else happening inside me, something I didn't understand then and I'm not sure I fully understand now. I'd spent years in these woods, years learning to read the language of survival and suffering. I'd pulled porcupine quills from a wolf's muzzle, splinted the broken leg of a deer, sat with a dying owl until it passed. This was different. God, it was so different, but the core of it was the same. Something was suffering, and I had the power to help. What do you need? I heard myself ask, my voice rough and strange in the cold air. The creature made a sound like wind through hollow bones. It took me a moment to realize it was trying to breathe, to gather strength. When it spoke again, the meaning came through crystal clear. Food. Can't hunt. Too weak. My mind was racing. What did a Wendigo eat? The legends said human flesh, that they were cursed with an insatiable hunger for their own kind. But looking at this skeletal thing huddled in the darkness, I wondered if the legends had it backwards. Maybe the hunger came from deprivation. Maybe the horror stories were about what starvation could drive any creature to do. I have food, I said, my voice steadier now. In my pack. I'd brought jerky, dried fruit, granola bars, standard trail rations. Nothing substantial. But the way the creature's eyes tracked my movements as I shrugged off my rucksack told me it didn't care what I offered. It was that desperate. I pulled out the jerky first, tearing open the package with numb fingers. The smell of dried meat filled the air. I tossed the package toward the creature, not ready to get any closer. It moved faster than something that malnourished should have been able to move. One of those impossible hands shot out, caught the package, brought it to its mouth. I heard the sound of tearing plastic, then chewing. Not the savage tearing I expected, but slow, deliberate, almost careful. Like it was trying to remember how to eat. I stood there and watched, my back to the open door, cold wind seeping in around me. The rational part of my brain was still shouting at me to leave, but I couldn't. I was transfixed. This thing shouldn't exist, but it did. It was real, it was suffering, and I was watching it eat jerky like it was the most precious thing in the world. When it finished, it looked at me again. Those burning eyes held something I hadn't expected to see. Gratitude. More? I asked. It nodded. The gesture was almost human. I gave it everything I had, the rest of the jerky, the granola bars, even the dried fruit. It ate slowly, methodically, each piece of food handled with something approaching reverence. And as it ate, I found myself stepping closer, my fear giving way to something else. Curiosity. Wonder. A strange sense of connection. When the food was gone, the creature settled back against the wall. It looked marginally better, less like it was about to collapse into dust. We sat there in silence for a long time, me by the door, it in its corner, both of us processing what had just happened. Finally, I spoke. How long have you been here? Weeks. Maybe months. Time. Difficult. Why can't you hunt? It shifted and I saw the problem. Its left leg was bent at a wrong angle, the bone clearly broken. The flesh around it was dark, possibly infected. In its condition, it couldn't have caught a rabbit, let alone anything substantial enough to sustain a creature its size. Fell, it said. Through roof. Couldn't climb out. I looked up and saw the hole in the ceiling, 20 feet above us. Snow had drifted through it, covering part of the floor. The creature must have been trapped here, unable to hunt, slowly starving in the ruins of this forgotten place. I can bring more food, I heard myself say. Tomorrow. I'll come back. I don't know why I said it. Don't know what made me commit to returning to this impossible situation. But something in those eyes, something in the desperate dignity of how it had eaten, made me unable to just walk away. Why? It asked, and the question held genuine confusion. Because you're suffering, I said simply. And I can help. The creature was silent for a long moment. Then, dangerous. For you. If others know. No one knows I'm here. No one knows this place exists except me and a helicopter pilot who mentioned it in passing. Your secret's safe. My secret, it repeated, and there was something like bitter amusement in the thought. Yes. Secret. Always secret. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the creature. I'll come back tomorrow. I promise. John, it said, and I froze. I hadn't told it my name. Your thoughts. Loud. Clear. I hear. John. Of course. If it could communicate directly into my mind, it could probably read my surface thoughts too. The idea should have terrified me, but instead, I felt an odd sense of relief. No pretense. No hiding. Just raw, honest communication. What do I call you? I asked. It considered this. Had name. Long ago. Forgotten. You can call me what you wish. I'll think about it, I said, and then I left. The walk back to the outpost passed in a blur. My mind was spinning, trying to process what had just happened, what I'd just promised to do. I was going to return to that abandoned logging camp. I was going to bring food to a Wendigo. I was going to keep a secret that could destroy everything I thought I knew about the world. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. I thought about legends and reality, about the line between them, about how thin that line really was. I thought about suffering and kindness, about the choice I'd made without really deciding. And I thought about those eyes, burning in the darkness, looking at me with gratitude and confusion and something that might have been hope. I'd crossed a line today. Stepped into territory that humans weren't meant to enter. But as I finally drifted toward sleep, I realized something that should have scared me but didn't. I was going back. tomorrow and every day after. I'd made a promise to something impossible, and I was going to keep it, even if it changed everything, even if I could never tell another soul, even if, 30 years later, I'd still be carrying the weight of what came next. I returned the next day with as much food as I could carry without raising suspicions at the supply depot. Canned meats, dried fish, protein bars, anything with high calories and long shelf life. I told myself I was just helping an injured animal, that this was no different than the wildlife rehabilitation I'd done before. But I knew that was a lie. What waited for me in that ruined logging camp was no animal. The creature was exactly where I'd left it, still crouched in that dark corner, but its eyes were brighter when I entered. Alert. Waiting. You came back, it said, and there was wonder in the thought. I said I would. I'd brought a camping stove this time, and a pot. I set about melting snow for water while the creature watched with what I'd started to recognize as curiosity. As the water heated, I opened cans of corned beef, mixed in some dried vegetables I'd brought. It wasn't much, but it was warm food. Real food. The kind that might actually help something heal. Why do this? It asked while I cooked. Humans, fear, kill, never help. I considered the question while stirring the pot. Most humans have never met you. They only know the stories. Stories true. Once. The thought carried weight, sadness, something ancient. Hunger. Makes monsters. Of anyone. I poured the hot stew into a metal bowl and slid it across the floor. The creature pulled itself forward, movements still painful but more controlled than yesterday. As it began to eat, I settled against the opposite wall, far enough to not crowd it, close enough to talk. How long have you been? What you are? I asked. It was quiet for a long time, eating slowly. Finally. Long, very long. Memory. Difficult. Pieces. Time different for me. Do you remember being human? The creature stopped eating. Its whole body went still. When it finally answered, the thought came heavy with emotion I couldn't quite identify. Sometimes. Dreams. Faces. Words I knew. Feelings. But then wake and this. It gestured at itself with one elongated hand. This all that real. Over the following weeks, I fell into a routine. I'd spend my mornings doing my actual job, checking trails, monitoring weather conditions, maintaining my cover. Afternoons, I'd make the trek to the logging camp with supplies. At first, I told myself I'd stop once the creature could hunt again, once its leg healed enough for it to survive on its own. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized I was lying to myself. I kept coming back because I wanted to. Because these visits had become the most interesting part of my life. Because for the first time since I'd fled to these woods, I felt like I was having real conversations. The creature, I'd started calling it gray for the weathered color of its skin, was intelligent in ways that made me question what intelligence really meant. It couldn't remember specific facts about its past life, but it understood concepts on a level that sometimes left me stunned. We talked about the forest, about survival, about the nature of isolation. Gray's thoughts came slowly, carefully constructed, each word seeming to cost effort. But the meaning was always profound. You hide too, Gray said one afternoon, after I'd mentioned needing to keep its existence secret. Not from world. From yourself. The observation hit harder than it should have. What do you mean? You come to woods. Alone. No family. No connections. You say is choice. But choice and fear. Sometimes same thing. I didn't have an answer to that. Because Gray was right. I'd told myself I chose solitude, but the truth was more complicated. I'd been running from expectations, from the pressure to be normal, to fit into a life that never felt like mine. The woods gave me permission to be isolated without having to explain why. Maybe we're not so different, I said quietly. Maybe, Gray agreed. Both, in between. Not one thing or other. Both trying, survive. As January gave way to February, Gray's leg began to heal. I'd splinted it as best I could, using techniques I'd learned for wildlife rescue. The creature's metabolism was strange, It healed faster than it should have, but the process seemed to cause it immense pain. I'd arrive some days to find it curled in on itself, shaking, that horrible smell of rot thick in the air. Other days it would be sitting upright, almost alert, teaching me words from the language it half remembered from its human life. But healing also meant change was coming. Gray would soon be strong enough to leave, to return to whatever existence Wendigos lived in the deep wilderness. And I found myself dreading that departure more than I wanted to admit. "What will you do?" I asked one evening in mid-February. "When you can hunt again?" Gray was silent for a long time. "Move. Must move. Stay one place too long. Dangerous. For me. For you. Where will you go?" "North. Canada. Deeper wilderness. Fewer humans." It paused. "Lonely. But safe." I understood loneliness. Had chosen it even. But there was a difference between solitude and isolation, between being alone by choice and being alone because the world feared what you were. "I'll miss these conversations," I said, and was surprised by how much I meant it. "Yes," Gray said simply. "Me too." But it was early March when everything changed. I was at the outpost, preparing supplies for my afternoon visit, when I heard the helicopter. That wasn't unusual. Supply drops came every few weeks. But this helicopter sounded different, louder. And it was hovering, searching. I stepped outside and saw it circling about 5 miles north. Right over the valley. Right over the logging camp. My blood went cold. I grabbed my radio and called the supply coordinator. "This is Ranger John at Station 7. What's the helicopter doing in my sector?" "Search and rescue op," came the crackling reply. "Hikers reported missing in your area. Last seen heading toward an old logging camp. You know anything about that?" My mind raced. No one should have known about that camp except me and that pilot from December. But if hikers had found it, if they'd gone inside. "I know the location," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can guide the ground team if you need me." Negative. Helicopter spotted what looks like a structure fire. Smoke rising from the valley. They're bringing in a crew to investigate. Stay at your post unless ordered otherwise. A fire. Gray wouldn't have started a fire. It was too weak and too smart to draw attention. Which meant someone else was there. Hikers exploring the ruins. Maybe using the old fireplace, not knowing what lived in the shadows. I grabbed my emergency pack and headed north at a run. Snowshoes forgotten in my panic. I had to get there before the rescue team. Had to warn Gray. Had to get it out before humans with cameras and radios and guns discovered what shouldn't exist. The 4-hour hike took me 2.5, my lungs burning with cold and exertion. I could see smoke rising from the valley ahead, thick and dark against the blue sky. The helicopter had moved on, probably returning for the ground team. I crashed through the trees and into the clearing. The main building was indeed burning, flames visible through the windows, smoke pouring from the damaged roof. And standing outside, staring at the fire with expressions of horror and confusion, were 2 hikers, college-aged kids with expensive gear and cameras hanging from their necks. They turned when they heard me approach, relief flooding their faces. "Thank God," one of them said. "We found this place and thought we'd camp inside, but when we lit a fire in the old fireplace, the whole wall caught. And then we heard." He trailed off, looking back at the burning building with fear in his eyes. "We heard something inside. Something moving. My heart stopped. Did you see what it was?" "No," we ran. But it sounded wrong. Not like an animal. We called for rescue, said there might be someone trapped inside. I looked at the burning building. Gray was still in there. Injured, weak, unable to escape through the flames. And within the hour, this place would be crawling with rescue personnel. I didn't think. I just moved. I ran toward the building, ignoring the hikers' shouts behind me. The heat hit me like a physical wall, but I pushed through, covering my face with my scarf. Inside was hell. Flames climbing the walls, smoke so thick I could barely see. "Gray!" I shouted, knowing the hikers could hear, not caring anymore. "Gray, where are you?" John. The thought came weak, pained. John, leave. Save yourself. I followed the voice toward the back of the building, where the flames hadn't fully reached yet. And there was Gray, trapped beneath a collapsed beam, unable to pull itself free. The fire was spreading fast. I grabbed the beam with both hands, felt the heat searing through my gloves. Lifted with everything I had. Gray pulled itself out, movements agonizingly slow. Can you move? I gasped. Yes. But John, witnesses. They see you. See me. Everything changes. I don't care. Move. We made it out through a side door just as part of the roof collapsed behind us. I half-dragged, half-supported Gray into the tree line, the two hikers still visible in the clearing but not looking our direction, focused on the main entrance. In the shelter of the pines, I finally let myself look at Gray. The creature was burned, injured worse than before, but alive. Go, I said. North like you planned. Go now before they bring dogs. John. The thought was clear despite Gray's pain. Thank you. For everything. For seeing. Not monster. Just being. I'll never forget you, I said, and meant it with everything in me. Nor I you. Carry this. What you learned. Some things. Not what they seem. Some monsters, made by fear. Real monsters. The ones who never question what they're told. And then Gray was gone, disappearing into the forest with a speed I wouldn't have thought possible. I stood there for a moment, watching the trees, then turned and walked back toward the hikers. I had a story to prepare. A lie to construct. A secret to keep. The rescue team arrived 20 minutes later and found 3 people standing around a burned-out logging camp. The hikers told their story about lighting a fire and hearing something inside. I told mine about investigating the smoke and finding them. No one mentioned a creature. No one mentioned anything impossible. But late that night, back at my outpost, I lay awake thinking about Gray's final words. About monsters and fear. About the things we refuse to see because seeing them would challenge everything we believe. I'd saved a Wendigo's life today. And in doing so, I'd learned something that would stay with me forever. Sometimes the real darkness isn't in the creatures we fear. It's in the fear itself. The investigators came 3 days later. 2 rangers from the regional office, asking questions about the fire, about the hiker's report, about what exactly I'd seen. I gave them the story I'd rehearsed, arrived after the fire started, helped the hikers, found no evidence of anyone or anything trapped inside. The structure was old, unstable, filled with decades of dry wood and debris. Of course, it had burned fast. They seemed satisfied. Told me to file a report and mark the location as hazardous on my maps. Within a week, the whole incident was forgotten by everyone except me. But I couldn't forget. Couldn't stop thinking about those final moments. Gray disappearing into the trees, wounded and alone again. I'd spent months visiting that creature, and in the space of an afternoon, it was gone. The logging camp was gone. The only evidence that any of it had happened was the burns on my hands and the emptiness that settled into my chest. I kept working my post through the rest of that winter, then through spring and into summer. But something had changed in me. The solitude I'd once cherished felt different now. Not peaceful but hollow. I'd had something rare, something impossible, and I'd lost it. Every time I walked those northern trails, I found myself looking for signs, hoping against hope that I might see Gray one more time. I never did. That autumn, a new ranger named Sarah transferred to a neighboring station. We met at a regional meeting in October, and I was immediately struck by her. Not just her looks, though she was beautiful in a practical, outdoorsy way, but her presence. She had this quality of really seeing people, really listening when you talked. After years of isolation, I found myself actually wanting to have a conversation. We started meeting for coffee when she came to the depot for supplies. Those meetings turned into longer talks, then dinners in town on our days off. By December, we were together most weekends, either at her station or mine. She was good for me in ways I didn't know I needed. She drew me out of myself, made me remember how to connect with another human being. But I couldn't tell her about Gray. Couldn't share the secret that had become the defining experience of my life. It created a space between us, a place I couldn't let her enter. She felt it too. I could see the questions in her eyes sometimes when I'd zone out, staring at the northern forest, thinking about that winter. "You're somewhere else," she said one evening in February. We were sitting in my cabin, a year almost exactly since I'd last seen Gray. "Sometimes you just disappear. Where do you go?" "Just thinking," I said. "Old memories. Want to share them?" I wanted to. God, I wanted to tell her everything. But how do you explain the inexplicable? How do you tell someone you trust that you spent months caring for a creature that shouldn't exist, that you formed a connection with something the world calls a monster? "Maybe someday," I said, and hated myself for the lie. We got married that June. Small ceremony, just us and 2 witnesses, up on a ridge overlooking the forest. Sarah moved into my station, and for a while I thought I might be able to move forward, to build a new life that wasn't defined by one impossible winter. But secrets have weight, and mine was heavy enough to bend everything around it. The problems started small. Sarah would want to explore the northern valleys, and I'd always find reasons we should go elsewhere. She'd suggest day hikes to new territory, and I'd redirect us to familiar ground. She noticed. Started asking why I avoided that whole section of forest. "There's nothing up there but old ruins and rough terrain," I'd say. "That's exactly why I want to see it," she'd reply. "We're forest rangers. Rough terrain is kind of our thing." I held her off for 2 years. Made excuses, changed plans, manufactured emergencies. But I could feel the distance growing between us. The question she stopped asking because she'd learned I wouldn't answer. The resignation in her eyes when I'd deflect again. It came to a head one morning in August. We'd been married for 2 years, and she confronted me over breakfast. "What happened up north, John?" Direct. No preamble. I set down my coffee. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean. That whole section of forest, the one you avoid like it's radioactive. Something happened there. Something you won't talk about. And it's eating at you. Has been since before I met you." "Sarah." "No." Her voice was firm but not angry. "Just tired. I love you. But I can't keep living with half of you. There's a part of yourself you won't share, and it's creating a wall between us. Either you trust me with whatever this is or—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. I sat there, torn between 2 impossible choices. Keep the secret and lose the woman I loved, or break the silence and risk. What? Her thinking I was insane. Her reporting it, leading to investigations, hunts, the destruction of everything Gray and I had protected? "If I tell you," I said slowly, "you have to promise me something. Promise you'll hear me out completely before you react. Before you decide I'm crazy." Her expression softened. "John, I would never think you're crazy. Promise anyway." "I promise." So I told her. Everything. The logging camp, the creature, the months of visits, the conversations, the fire, the rescue. I told her about Gray's intelligence, its capacity for thought and emotion, the way it had understood isolation better than any human I'd met. I told her about the final words, about monsters and fear, about the weight I'd carried for 4 years. When I finished, the cabin was silent except for the sound of wind through the pines outside. Sarah sat across from me, her coffee untouched, her expression unreadable. "Say something," I finally whispered. "I believe you," she said, and I felt something break loose in my chest. "I believe you because I know you, John. You don't lie. You don't embellish. And I've seen the way you look at those northern woods, like you lost something precious there." She paused. "Do you ever wonder if it's still out there? If it survived? Every day? Do you want to look for it?" The question surprised me. I don't know. Part of me thinks I should leave it alone. It's safer that way for both of us. But another part wants to know if your friend made it, Sarah finished. If the thing you saved found whatever peace is possible for a creature like that. Friend. She'd called Gray my friend, and the word felt right in a way that made my throat tight. "We could go," she said quietly. "Up north. Just to look. No expectations. Just closure, maybe." So we did. On a clear morning in late August, we packed light gear and headed north together. I led us to where the logging camp had been, though there was little left now, just charred foundations and the ghosts of structures reclaimed by forest. We searched the area for hours, looking for signs, for tracks, for anything that might indicate Gray had returned or passed through. We found nothing. The forest was empty, pristine, showing no evidence that anything unusual had ever existed there. As the sun started to set, we gave up and made camp nearby. Sarah built a fire while I gathered water from a stream. We ate in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. "I'm sorry we didn't find anything," Sarah said eventually. "Me too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe Gray found what it was looking for. Deeper wilderness, true isolation, a place to exist without fear. Maybe that's the best ending." "Do you think you'll ever stop wondering?" "No," I admitted. "But having someone else know, someone who doesn't think I'm insane, that helps. More than you know." She reached across the fire and took my hand. "We all carry things, John. Experiences that change us in ways we can't fully explain. You're not alone with this anymore." And for the first time in 4 years, I felt the weight shift. Not disappear, it would never disappear, but become bearable. Shared. We sat there under the stars, my wife and I, in the forest where I'd once met the impossible. And I thought about Gray somewhere far to the north, living whatever life a creature like that could have. I hoped it was well. Hoped it remembered our conversations with something like fondness. Hoped it had found its own version of peace. The fire burned down to embers. Sarah leaned against my shoulder. And in that moment I realized something profound. The secret hadn't just been about protecting Gray. It had been about protecting myself. From judgment, from disbelief, from having to defend an experience that defied explanation. But in finally sharing it, I'd learned another truth. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't keeping a secret. It's trusting someone else to help you carry it. 25 years have passed since that night when Sarah and I camped in the ruins of the logging camp. 25 years since I finally shared the weight I'd been carrying. In that time, I've learned that secrets don't just burden the keeper. They shape them, mold them, become inseparable from who they are. Sarah and I worked as rangers for another decade after that night. We transferred to different forests, saw different landscapes, helped different people. But I never stopped thinking about Gray, never stopped scanning the shadows of deep wilderness, hoping for one more glimpse of something impossible. We retired 5 years ago and bought a small cabin in northern Minnesota, not far from where it all began. Sarah likes to joke that I couldn't stay away, and she's not wrong. This forest is in my blood now, woven through my memories like the rings in an old tree. I'm 55 years old now. The age when men start to look back more than forward, when they begin to measure what they've learned against what they still have time to do. And sitting here on my porch, watching the sun set over the same woods where I once met a legend, I find myself thinking about those words Gray spoke in the darkness of a burning building. Real monsters. The ones who never question what they're told. I've thought about that statement for 30 years, turned it over in my mind like a stone worn smooth by water. And I've come to understand something profound about fear and belief, about the stories we tell ourselves about the world. The Ojibwe, who first named the Wendigo, weren't describing a monster in the way we think of monsters now. They were describing what happens when hunger, physical or spiritual, consumes a person so completely that they lose their humanity. They were warning about greed, about taking more than you need, about the darkness that lives in unchecked desire. But somewhere along the way, the metaphor became literal. The warning became a creature. And the creature became something to hunt, to fear, to destroy without question. What I met in those woods wasn't the monster from the stories. It was something far more complex, a being trapped between states of existence, cursed with intelligence enough to suffer, isolated by a reputation built on legend rather than truth. Gray never asked to be what it was, never chose the hunger or the form or the loneliness. And yet it survived, maintained dignity. showed compassion when it could have chosen violence, taught me lessons about humanity that I couldn't have learned from any human teacher. I never saw Gray again after the fire. In my more fanciful moments, I imagine it found others like itself, that somewhere in the deep wilderness of Canada there's a community of impossible beings living out their existence in careful secrecy. More realistically, I suspect Gray lived and died alone, as it had probably lived for decades or centuries before our paths crossed. But either way, it left its mark on me, changed how I see the world, how I understand the line between human and other, between monster and misunderstood. Sarah and I have told only one other person about Gray, our daughter Anna. She was born 3 years after that night at the ruins, and we raised her with an understanding that the world is stranger and more complex than most people acknowledge. When she was 16 and asking those big questions about belief and reality, we sat her down and told her the story. Her response was simple: "I want to meet one." "Maybe you will," I said. "Maybe you'll have your own impossible encounter someday. But if you do, I hope you'll remember this. Before you decide something is a monster, make sure you're not just seeing your own fear reflected back." She's 30 now, working as a wildlife biologist in Alaska. She calls sometimes with stories about bears or wolves that behave in unexpected ways, about the intelligence she sees in creatures most people dismiss as simple animals. And I hear echoes of that lesson in how she approaches her work, with openness, with curiosity, with a willingness to question assumptions. Maybe that's the real legacy of my winter with Gray. Not the secret itself, but what the secret taught me about seeing. Last night I couldn't sleep. The insomnia that comes with age, made worse by a mind that won't stop turning over memories. So I got up, made coffee, and sat on the porch watching the forest in darkness. And I swear, I heard something in the trees. Not a sound exactly, more like a presence. A weight in the air that pressed against my consciousness in a way that felt familiar. I stood up, walked to the edge of the porch. "Gray!" I called softly, not wanting to wake Sarah. "Is that you?" No response. Just wind and darkness and the smell of pine. But as I turned to go back inside, I felt it. That same sensation of meaning bypassing language, of thoughts touching mine from outside. Not words. Just acknowledgement. Recognition. The mental equivalent of a nod between old friends passing on a street. And then it was gone. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wishful thinking of an old man who wants to believe that strange friendship wasn't just a dream. But I don't think so. I think Gray passes through sometimes, checking on the forest, maybe checking on me. Making sure the secret keeper is still keeping the secret, still protecting the mystery. And I am. I will until my last breath. Because that's what you do when something, trusts you with their existence. You honor that trust. But I'm telling this story now because I'm 55, and that's young enough to still have decades ahead, but old enough to know that decades pass faster than you think. And before I'm too old to remember clearly, before the details blur into vague impressions, I want to put this down. Want to create a record of what I learned. So here it is, the truth I've carried for 30 years. Monsters are real. But so is compassion. So is understanding. So is the capacity to see past fear into the complicated reality underneath. I met a Wendigo in the woods, and it taught me what it means to be human. It taught me that humanity isn't about what form you wear or what appetites you struggle with. It's about the choices you make in moments of fear. It's about whether you see only what you expect to see, or whether you're brave enough to see what's actually there. Gray told me something in those final moments that I've never shared before. One last thought as it disappeared into the forest. "You saved my life, John. But I saved yours too. You were dying when we met. Dying of isolation, of believing you had to be alone. You needed to see that connection was possible, even in impossible circumstances. Thank you for letting me be that for you." It was right. I was dying in that cabin, withering into myself, using solitude as a shield against the messiness of human relationship. Gray forced me to connect, to engage, to care about something beyond my own comfort. And that openness, that willingness to reach across an impossible divide, is what eventually allowed me to build a life with Sarah, to be a father to Anna, to be something more than just a hermit in the woods. The sun is rising now. I can see the forest emerging from darkness, each tree becoming distinct, individual, real. Sarah will be up soon, and we'll have breakfast, and I'll spend another day in these woods I love. But I'll carry Gray with me. Always. In every tree shadow, every unexplained sound, every moment when I choose to question my assumptions rather than accept them blindly. That's what that winter taught me. That's what I'm leaving as my testimony. The world is stranger than we know. And that strangeness isn't something to fear. It's something to wonder at, to respect, to protect. Some secrets are worth keeping. Some friendships transcend every boundary we think exists. And some monsters, when you really look at them, aren't monsters at all. They're just beings trying to survive in a world that refuses to see them clearly. Just like the rest of us. I hope you found whatever you were looking for, Gray. I hope the North gave you the peace you deserved. And I hope somehow you know that I kept my promise. I never forgot you. And I never will.